What is it that you know about the continent of Lemuria? Where was it? When was it? And where did you get the information from? Where did you learn about it?
Well, the continent of Lemuria, it has been at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean now for 26,000 years. But for the last 50 years, it has been rising, and it has caused certain volcanic activity around the edge of it, so that now that it's getting up high, the whole earth is heating up on account of this activity here. I mean, we think since the North Pole has had all of its ice melted away from it, and the South Pole is pretty close to that, we think that that's where the heat is, but it's coming from a lot of places, actually. It's coming from this continent rising, which is where the kingdom of God will ultimately be built, on this ancient continent, which was called the Lemurian continent. And what we'll try to do by building this kingdom of God is we're trying to replicate the very first civilization on earth, which Christ himself came to earth to be responsible for making, because all of the other planets of our solar system have been just learning their lessons, learning all there is to know, learning to be masters, and then angels, then archangels. And we on earth are just way behind, making wars, wrecking the world, wrecking our resources because of our ignorance. But so Christ and the angels and archangels thousands of years ago were becoming very concerned that this was happening, because how were we going to get out of Eden, where we can just pick fruit off the tree and we don't have to work or make effort? We just have this wonderful, easy life, and we're learning nothing and getting nowhere. So we will have heard the name of Lucifer. Many connotations have been put on that name, but Lucifer was one of the angels of our angelic host on planet Earth. He and the other angels lived and live on the moon, but they are responsible for Earth. Jehovah was the head angel, and Jehovah thought, well, it's true, they haven't started making any progress yet, but on some other planets in the universe, they have done that. Let's just wait. And Lucifer and a whole contingent of angels were saying, hey, we cannot wait any longer. They have wasted 400,000 years already with making no progress. We have to just throw them out of Eden and let them start to learn whatever it takes to build. And so that's what they did. But in that is incorrect. Angels are not supposed to be warring with their own team. Christ felt like, or I'm going to call him Christ, but his name is Melchizedek. He felt like that this was so inappropriate. He reassigned Jehovah to some other planet, angelic host, and then Lucifer and his cohorts he assigned to another planet. And then Christ himself accepted, or I keep saying Christ, but that's what people recognize. Melchizedek himself accepted responsibility for getting the planet Earth to start making some progress. And so this was 78,000 years ago, he came to Earth and began on the continent in the middle of the Pacific, the Lemurian continent, to teach those tribes and help them start to make some sort of progress. And ultimately they did have a civilization. It lasted for 52,000 years. However, it did ultimately run into trouble, and it's too long a story to tell here now. So there came a time when we were not making any progress in that civilization, and we all incarnated during that civilization. That's why we often have a memory of how good things could be or how they should be, and we're not doing it, so. And this is contained in a book that we learned about, The Ultimate Frontier. The whole story is, here are two versions of it. But there have been many versions over the last 50 years because we did come here to Stell, and we spent, 10 years really building the community as it is now. And then things started falling apart, going sour. It was a great loss to mankind, I feel sure, and certainly to civilization. What we call civilization right now, to me, just in my lifetime, goes from something that, let's say we had made this much progress. To me, we've just been drifting down and down. We're electronically much more knowledgeable, and we can make a number of gadgets and things like that, but that's not our souls. That's not helping our souls make any progress. I mean, all the movies now are fictional accounts. All the reading material is fictional accounts. When they're interviewing somebody on the radio these days, they're interviewing them about their fictional stories, which have now been made into movies and now won awards for their makers and all of these things, but it's all not really uplifting anybody.
So are you saying that the culture that we live in now is much less developed than the culture that had been developed in Lemuria?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We are the fifth greatest civilization alive today. I mean, India was one of the predominant ones, but of course, Lemuria was the first and the best. But then when things crashed and Lemuria sank into the sea, then ultimately what we call Atlantis was built in the Atlantic Ocean, but they called it Poseid. It was named after Poseidonus, a great master at that time. But ultimately, Atlantis was not a great civilization. It was one of those that did make some progress, but it was mostly concerned with quick, like many, how should we say, like a lot of apartment or ticky-tacky kinds of architecture, not great architecture. But in Lemuria, we still have remains on the islands in the Pacific of great stone roads, great stone buildings and things like that, which if anybody wants something to help them believe all of this stuff that we're exposing now, it is there all over the Pacific.
But you mentioned that there were 5 great civilizations, or we are the 5th greatest. which were and Lemuria was the first, which were the second, third, and fourth, if you know?
Let's see, wasn't India fourth and we're fifth? So that was Lemuria, Atlantis, India.
Was there a Chinese empire at one point?
I just know that 5,000 years we've had China as a predominant cultural factor in the world,
Yes.
and they still are in many ways.
Well, so we've had all these different civilizations, but how come we don't learn about them in our history books? How come they don't show up in our knowledge base in Western civilization? Has it been
Well,
hidden on purpose, or is it just not known?
not known, because I mean, when a civilization collapses, then who even knows about it after that? The fact that we're talking about it here means that we got it from beings who have much more intelligence and historical knowledge than we do. I mean, our angelic and archangelic hosts, we have gotten some information from God directly from the celestial host. But
let's take a minute then, and since you're referring to these texts right here, would you talk a little bit about the Ultimate Frontier? Like, when was it written, and what is the source of, who is the author, and what is the source of that information, to the best of your knowledge?
sure, this looks like the original. This is just a duplication of it printed years later, but this was the first copy of it printed in 1963. And that was the one I read.
The
But,
name of the book is?
The Ultimate Frontier.
Yeah, by
Eklal Kushana. Does it say? I don't have my place. Oh yeah, Eklal Kushana. That was a name that Richard, the founder of Stel, was given when he was 12 years old. Higher beings, very highly evolved people spoke to him several times during his 12th year of life, and gave him the notion that he had accepted the responsibility before incarnating at this time to help establish the kingdom of God. First, he was to establish the city of Stel, which was to have become the second largest city in Illinois, which did not happen, unfortunately. But then he was to go to the Pacific. There's an island in the Pacific, which is just the top of mountains, ancient Lemurian mountains, where he was to build a university. Because in the kingdom of God, education up through university is going to be available free of charge to every citizen in the country.
Right.
And they are expected to be learning continuously.
So that's the second city he's supposed to build.
Yes. And after Lemuria rises more out of the sea, then the nation of God would be built around that university. The university is really like the heart of it, the core of it. Education, starting with tiny babies. Education was accelerated so that we developed the knowledge and intelligence to be worthy of more knowledge and to extend our knowledge to those around us, build up the cultures build up the world around us.
Okay, so he was told about that when he was age 12,
Yes,
and that he would be involved in the founding of those three cities, or in the beginning of the kingdom of God, I guess, is what you're saying.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
And how did the story go then? Did he embrace that fully, and was he enthusiastic about it?
I think he was very frightened of it. I mean, being 12 years old and not having recovered memory of prior lifetimes and things like that, that was very frightening to him. And ultimately, that was why we didn't create Cell. He just could not stick with the program. He could not maintain what the plan was. But his teachers gave him a place in a distant state where some years before the end of the last century, he was to move his community there. We used to just worry, what is his community? Aren't we his community? But ultimately, since he wasn't accepting his mission, did not want to do it, it was a gentle way that the higher beings had of just getting him off the scene. And that would have been our opportunity to start building this great city here,
Right.
where all the citizens would be so highly evolved and such upstanding people, cooperating, working together hand in hand to build whatever had to be built. But since that wasn't, I know that Richard made some efforts when he was out in the West. He did fly over the island where the university was supposed to have been built.
Did that place have a name?
Yes. But Richard was careful never to say it for fear that it would drive up the price of real estate.
Oh, the island, but what was he going to call it? Did he have a name for this city in the ocean he was going to be developing? Was it Philadelphia?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course, that's what you were fishing for. Yes, it was Philadelphia. The significance of that name, of course, is the city of brotherly love. That's what we're supposed to all be building all around us, everywhere, every day. We should not be at this low point, since we've had some access to this information for all these years. Not very many people have cared to push it. Well, I mean, we've made so many wars that killed off so many of the men so many times. We spend our resources on wars, not on universities and great cities or great civilization.
So then what you're saying is that there are all these civilizations, but when the civilization fell, and particularly when there was severe geological changes, that most of humanity then would have been wiped out, and those who survived were not able to recreate that culture. There weren't enough people or ability, and within 2, 3, 4 generations, it's more of a story than a reality. And humans,
Even if it was a story, I mean, when everybody dies off, I mean, who's going to remember? And that's why there are many people who had gained a great deal of advancement, personal advancement, and were ready to help build the kingdom of God. But for 12 to 15,000 years, there's not been a civilization worthy of them. They would be wasting their time. They would probably forget their mission. So that has happened to many people over the eons. They incarnated hoping to help build a better civilization, but it didn't happen. So,
well, you've brought up this comment about reincarnating. So apparently you believe there is something to that concept of reincarnation. What do you imagine it to be? I mean, what's your understanding of reincarnation? And how many times do you think most people have maybe reincarnated, if it's true?
Okay, let's hope I can remember all those details. Well, just consider, how could there possibly be any justice in the world or the universe if we only get one lifetime? If that's an unhappy life, we're just out of luck. But if we have a difficult difficult lifetime, it's because of something that we need, something we did not learn in another lifetime. By this time, if we've lived in the United States of America and we've gone to college and things like that, we've probably incarnated 2,000 to 3,000 times. I mean, that's what Richard was told. But if we watch Finding Your Roots, for instance, on TV, we will see how many people have been struggling to stay alive, struggling to, we have just not created a happy place for humanity to evolve well. But I mean, speaking of reincarnation, like I said, how could there be any justice if you just get one lifetime and you're Black and you're poor and you don't get any education? What hope is there going to be for you? If you're in that situation in this lifetime, it's because of deficiencies in your life in past incarnations. So you're just being given an opportunity to really begin to grow out of that unhappy situation, or to teach many people who of other races who are incarnate now, incarnated to help uplift their people. There are many people of color in this country who are outstanding individuals, and they are doing a lot to uplift their race at this time. But we have all incarnated into every race in the world at one time or another during these. It's more than hundreds of, well, it's thousands and thousands of years.
So you're saying every person has experienced at least one lifetime in every single race,
Yes,
and probably just about every time period on the planet.
yes,
So we've had incarnations in Lemuria. Maybe we experienced Atlantis. Maybe experienced the other great civilizations. But when those civilizations fail, there's a point where we choose to come back. And where we end up has to do with the work it is we wish to do in the world, the lesson we wish to learn, or circumstances that we need to, in a sense, pay for. If we have negative karma, if we were cruel in one incarnation, we may need to experience cruelty in the next in order to understand how awful it is. Is that how that works? Is that what
yes.
karma is?
And there are no mistakes. If you get killed walking across a street, it is planned. It is not an accident. There are no accidents. Everything in our lives is something we have created and brought upon ourselves. When I was younger, I couldn't figure out how I could be responsible for the wars and all these things. But that's part of the karma of a situation you get born into. It's not a pleasant situation. My whole life, there's been a war after war after war, not only in this country, but in other countries. I mean, in your life too. It's just how it is. But let's see, did we finish saying, I was going to go back about reincarnation. Now, people who go to church say there can't be any reincarnation. And I remember reading some passages, especially in John and Matthew, I think it is, where Christ heals a blind man. And the disciples say, Lord, who sinned? This man who's blind or his parents, that they have to put up with a blind person? Which shows that they had been talking about this. I mean, Christ could not tell the world what he taught his disciples in private. He taught them about reincarnation as the most basic truth, that life will not make sense if you do not believe in it. And so Christ in that occasion said, well, in this case, neither he nor his parents sinned so badly, but that the works of God might be made known. And since he is God to us, he is the head of our whole solar system. He just reached out and healed this blind man. And there are a couple of other incidences in the New Testament, all in the Gospels.
But in that answer, I still don't understand who did sin. Was it the blind person or the parents? And what is the answer? Neither, both, or the culture?
Well, in that particular case, he said, well, he didn't really come here because of some sin he had committed. He wanted to experience the power of God, making his eyes open. And that's what Christ did. You know, he just healed him. In fact, many people took on an illness during Christ's 3 years of his ministry just to experience his hand on them. I mean, to me, that's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the years they had to struggle with whatever their problem was before Christ came and healed them. But, you know.
So in that light, then there must have been many people that incarnate in order, knowing that it's going to be a terrible situation, but they incarnate to do some kind of work in that circumstance.
Yes.
And then in another lifetime, they might experience a much more pleasant situation.
Yes.
But there are times when many of us, maybe millions of us, will show up on the planet in order to experience or participate or influence something that's happening in the world.
Yes, yes. In fact, everything in our incarnation, we have set up. We had to ask our parents before we were born if we might incarnate to them. Maybe we wanted to learn some particular talent that the parent had, or maybe we had a difficult time in another lifetime with that person. And so we have to learn how to be loving to this parent that we did not experience as a kind and good and loving parent. But we choose our parents, our moment of birth, and our name. If we control those 3 things, we control everything in our lives. The time we're coming into incarnation, everybody of us who are here now knew that we had the end time right in front of us. And that's where we are right now, as Russia is doing what it's doing, and the other countries are
In the
becoming.
Ukraine.
And yes, Ukraine and China.
That's happening right now as you and I speak. It's I think day 5, and Russia's just now starting to amp up their aggressive stance towards the Ukraine.
Yes.
And the Ukrainian people are standing very strong right now against it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's pretty sad.
It is. I mean, it's so sad that on Earth, war is the only consistent thing that we've really experienced as cultures, on and on. I mean, hardly any civilization that we can name lasted more than 200 years. I mean, even the Greeks, you know, I mean, the Greeks were so advanced. Christ was going to be shared with the world through them, but they really sort of goofed off and didn't have the moral stamina that was needed to start a new civilization. So that's why the Romans ended up, where we learned to build a civilization. I mean,
So let's ask this question then. If, we tend to think that we are the height of civilization on Earth, this Western culture, let's call it that for simplicity. But in relationship to the culture that was created in Lemuria, are we half as advanced as they are, or 90% as advanced as they are, or where do you think we are in relationship to?
well, for me, it's hard to compare those two because Lemuria was a commonwealth. They didn't have politics. They didn't have taxes. So many things that go with what's our capitalism.
Mhm.
They did not have. Capitalism is doomed to failure because it doesn't make a big deal of paying for everything you get. You can just call up the Federal Reserve and say, send me several $billion to build this, that, or the other thing. And we think nothing of it. We've been doing it for so long, but we haven't noticed that it's ruined our weather. It's gotten us in wars. It's done all of these other things. We have bad karma. And so now we're going to be paying for it more. But we're just so fortunate to be born in the United States of America. I mean, that we could grow up here, that even if we had to put up with capitalism, still we didn't have a lot of war except for the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. But so
as one of the ways that we measure advancement in the civilization is maybe how evolved the individuals are within that civilization. And of course, in every civilization, there's probably a wide range of people. But what I'm hearing you say is that the people from the Lemurian civilization had achieved very high levels of awareness and compassion, and even their ability to see what's truly valuable in life, and that those qualities were not in consumption and consumerism.
Though they experienced as much cultural
wealth
that they, compared to us, they lived like millionaires. As they had all of the things that a millionaire could want, but nobody was so stupid as to try to hang on to millions of dollars and hoard it or to buy up forests and cut them down and make the money off of them. You couldn't do that in Lemuria. Everything had to be correct because Christ was really, there was no government, but there were like bureaucrats who, for instance, if somebody was going to build a house and they needed so much lumber, a bureaucrat like that had been trained to find the trees that should be cut down so that it would work well with the rest of the forest, and then how to cut it and plane it and prepare it for building. But everything had this intentionality to it, that it was going to be the best for all concerned. When one person can buy up a whole half of a state of the United States and cut it down for timber, just think of the karmic debt that he is incurring for himself and his family. And it comes from lack of knowledge.
Right.
If you think you're getting away with it lifetime after lifetime, then you'll just keep doing those things. But we have to get back to real justice where that is not permissible. And that like, as we study the Lemurian civilization, which we will study so that we can replicate it in the kingdom of God, then that will be helping us to advance ourselves and to advance civilization.
So Lemuria then, in a sense, was a civilization of Lemuria, was a real commonwealth in that the individuals involved there, as you mentioned, their biggest concern was what is in the greatest good of all concerned. So nobody was interested in hoarding or getting more than anybody else. They were really interested in how good can we make it for all of us.
Yes.
And once something is built and it's paid for, and it's particularly made to last hundreds or thousands of years, you don't have to rebuild that house over and over and over again. And if your energy systems and your food systems are part of the landscape, and you're harvesting sunlight rather than, some kind of fossil fuel or something, then civilization can go on. People can experience high levels of freedom, high levels of abundance, and have the freedom to do what they want with their time. They don't need to work all the time in order to pay for things to consume.
Absolutely. In fact, the work week is 12 hours and only one person in the family works. So he works 6 hours, 2 days in the week. And his family can flourish. They have everything they need. Like, they don't have to pay for education. So that's one big thing that you would have the advantage of. And
Well, how are they going to pay for their medicines and the drugs that they need for depression and all those things?
I don't think they'll need those. That's a great question. Because, I mean, in ancient Lemuria, they did have a standing army, but since they had no wars to fight, the army was charged with, helping to maintain health, the health of the people. And I haven't ever heard of great illnesses or anything there. They didn't have it. I mean, they were so skillful in setting up a helpful environment. For instance, noise was cut to the greatest minimum possible. No traffic noise, no machine noise, no factory noises. And so it was beautiful and quiet and tranquil all the time for everybody. They didn't have to, I mean, in the Ultimate Frontier, it says, we can hardly imagine how our health is being harmed by the racket that we put up with and that we create.
So my guess is the whatever they needed in terms of medical care was probably free as well. Education was free.
Yeah.
Healthcare was probably free as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that is my understanding.
Yeah. And then when it came to education, could people then choose what areas they were interested in and go in that direction?
Oh, of course, yes. And women had an educational program up to age 28, and which meant that they, had time to get a college degree and things like that. They didn't get married until around that time for the most part, because, they knew that the parents had to be intelligent and well educated in order to rear the succeeding generation with great intelligence and so forth. So mothers, of course, you didn't have to be a mother if you didn't want to be, but if you were a mother, you were expected to homeschool your children, essentially. And of course, since the father only had to work 12 hours a week, he could contribute to, they could go on trips or field trips or whatever. They could just have a rich experience, create a rich experience for the children. But women, if they worked, usually worked in certain stores. Say they could sell clothes in the clothing stores, or let's see what else they taught. They could be a brilliant college professor if they wanted, whatever. But once you had children, in order to even get married, the young people had to live together for 3 years to demonstrate their compatibility, and that it would be likely that they would stick together. Because if they didn't, if they had a broken home, that was going to weaken the whole culture. So they had to live together for 3 years and demonstrate their compatibility. But also there was another important thing.
Was there education involved, and what does it take to be a parent, or what does it take to
Oh,
be a
yes,
couple?
they did have courses in that. Oh, but when you got married, it was the man and the woman and the state. All three of those were involved in the marriage, because the state is affected if the family breaks up and the children don't grow up becoming more intelligent and reasonable citizens and things like that. So there's a lot of expectation in the kingdom of God, of great personal love and intelligence and thoughtfulness. You know that you are upholding the whole civilization, so you have a responsibility.
So then what were maybe the larger goals of individuals? What would they seek? What were individuals seeking within their lifetime? What was their, some people seek, in our culture, seek wealth, they seek security, they seek love, they seek admiration from others. What kind of things were people in Lemuria? What did they seek? What were their goals in life?
Well, well, in that there was this culture-wide expectation that they become educated throughout their whole lives. I'm sure that anybody could pursue any personal goal that they had, but they might be very different from what our personal goals are. I mean, the vast majority of youths in this culture probably want to learn to play the guitar and make a lot of noise. And, it's after you get this picture of the kingdom of God, we're living in the lowest class, trashiest civilization right now. I mean, when do you hear on radio or television a lot of history being studied?
Well, also another way maybe it was expressed is that it was considered the most important job in the civilization was that of raising the next generation.
Oh,
And
yes.
so young people were given a wonderful education in what it takes to rear the next generation, and not just from the surface, but from a standpoint of spirituality, emotional maturity, and integrity. So all of
Absolutely.
those things were considered as well.
Yes, that's why education for children starts the day of birth. I mean, a child who is educated from his first day of life is going to be so brilliant that he will be able to make significant contribution to the environment. But what was interesting in Lemuria is, men who like to work with their hands, and there are a lot who do, would not have to take an office job to have the clout and the money that he would get. If he liked mowing lawns or pruning trees, he could do that to his heart's content. And then he would be paid for that. His 12 hours a week would pay him to prune trees or mow lawns or whatever he enjoyed doing. We just, in this culture, we have this hierarchy of who is more worthy because they make more money. But there was a scale in every, I'm sure in every means of making a living, there was a scale from the lowest level of skill and ability to the highest as to what you would be paid. And, and we were developing that in the early days of Cell, as I remember, something concrete. If you're going to work in this industry, then you need to be on this ladder learning these skills.
I'm wondering if we should go back to and just, and then I think we should wrap it up, but address the comment you made about how the community was established here, and maybe give it a date, 1970, when the land was purchased. I think building began in 71 and the first people moved in 73.
Mm-hmm.
But can you just, in general, can you just to talk about how, why it did not continue on and what happened?
I just don't want to have sound like I'm gossiping. Number one, Richard was afraid of the huge tasks that he was asked. Though he had been told of it before incarnating, it was scary when faced with that.
Sure.
But I've never known a spiritual leader in any community in the United States or Europe who didn't start, once he was such a high and mighty person, didn't start getting involved with other relationships, and that just destroys the credibility and the stability of everything.
Yeah.
And I just hate to tell that. I so admire Richard in so many ways. For years now, I've been listening to tapes that he made and things that he taught. And they are, as long as you're looking at those, they could not have gotten a better person to teach us what we needed to learn to get into the kingdom of God. But could we follow in his footsteps? We should in many ways, but we might not have fared well if we had done that. But I don't just kick him out. I mean, every day as I'm listening to his voice on CDs or tape, I just hear the extreme intelligence that he really had. And even when I'm doing the virtues exercises at night before I go to bed, when I read his descriptions of each virtue, I just don't know of anybody who could have described those so meaningfully. So, well, it's sort of good to know of somebody who's so great and high and well put together, because, we aren't as perfect as we could be. And so we don't have to kick ourselves. I mean, if we don't kick ourselves around, if we don't kick him around, we won't kick ourselves around, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then what happened is things just got very complicated here, and there was quite a falling out. A lot of people left, and he actually was told by his teachers to go and start another community down near Texas, in Texas. And he took about a third of the community with him, I believe.
He took 22 people with him, and they were the top of the STEL group, the best educated, the highest and best, maybe we could say. But then Gail, his wife, went to Wisconsin and took 40 some people. And, you know, they were all wonderful people too. But in neither of those two cases did it work out well. They didn't. Richard saw himself as doing the real STEL, and Gail saw herself as doing the real STEL, but it didn't work out.
Yeah.
So STEL is still here. It still means the place. If you're going to help build the kingdom of God, the place ought to be where to do it. So, you know, I'm just hoping that somehow people will gather and we will continue on with the work.
So at this point in the community of STEL, there aren't too many people who are holding on to the idea that STEL will become.
Oh,
the place.
absolutely not. No.
Yeah, it's pretty much, it's just been a homeowners association for, well, 40 years now, 40 years, yeah. And there are people that live here who don't know anything about the history
Right.
of the early days of STEL.
In fact,
And
most of them.
Yeah, most of them don't, and neither do they need to know, because it's not actively being pursued here by any significant number of people. But it is the thing that started this place, and those intentions carry an energy, and maybe created. Well, to some of us who live here, it feels like a pretty special place. It feels like the place does. It's not the place, but it is a pretty wonderful place.
It is, yeah.
And
you know, when I left STEL for 3 years and wandered in the West looking for who might be taking Richard's place, because they told him if he didn't accomplish these 3 huge tasks, then arrangements would be made for others to take his place. And so I wandered around the West looking. I went visited all kinds of communities looking for who might be building the kingdom of God, and I didn't find anybody. So I ultimately just came on back home. But let's see, I was starting to tell. While for 8 years, I published a newsletter from STEL called The Placemaker, and this is the place. And when I was wondering, looking for who might be the person to build STEL, I kept the addresses of the people who had left and things like that. So I visited them that's how I spent my nights. You know, I would go from this state to that state and spend the night with somebody else I knew. But what really gave me happiness was that most of all of those people were still wanting to read that little newsletter and keep up with everybody that they had known here. You know, it's like these are the real people. And, you know, now it's way behind us, but for many years, I think that's why I don't want to mention any names, but somebody came here and had an idea to build a little community within STEL and stayed quite a while and really tried so hard to contribute to getting STEL back on place, and it didn't work out. But, you know, I feel sort of responsible. He may be unhappy because we didn't do those things. But thank you for talking with me about these things, dear Bill.
One of the ways that I like describing the 10-year journey of the Stella Group, or those of us who came in those early days, is that we discovered that many of us from many walks of life showed up because we believed in a vision, and that a vision will hold a strong energy for people. Just a very strong pull, and people will come to be of service for that vision. But we discovered that it was harder to agree on how we were going to accomplish the goals than it was to agree on a vision. How we agreed on the vision, we just couldn't agree on how to get there. And that we lacked the emotional and maybe even spiritual maturity to be able to work together, including Richard, the founder, that we lacked the maturity to be able to see past those differences and work together for a common good. So we weren't ready, I guess, is maybe a way to say it.
Well, we were just raw candidates straight out of the common culture, It was the perfection we were wanting to create was way ahead of us.
Yeah.
But it was still great. I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, it was an amazing journey for many of the people who came in those early days. So then that's why people could still curious about what happened to everybody who was here back in those days.
Yeah.
But there have been a lot of communities that have started up in the Americas over the last 200 years. There's a lot of strong communities that showed up in the 1800s, and almost all of those have disbanded too. So starting intentional communities and having them succeed for long periods of time is very rare.
Yeah.
But the experience that people have when they go can be incredible.
Yeah.
Positive and negative.
Yes. Well, I think the reason that they couldn't persist over a long time is they didn't have enough of the truth in one place. I think we had access to so much truth that we hardly know how to implement it all. But it requires a lot and great devotion, So in our happy-go-lucky society we've created, it's hard to find people who want to give themselves so entirely to a great plan.